Okay, so this is another presentation in the series that we've been doing around trauma and its impact on students. And in some of the other presentations that I've done, we have touched on the issue of racial and historical trauma. But as people are starting to really think more about the impact of racial and historical trauma, and I think as students are really interested in talking about it with us as the adults in schools. I think just having more understanding of what the terms mean and what we're actually referring to when we say this. And so our objectives for this presentation are really to look at what the definitions are, including some of the theories about how they connect to the present day, highlighting, I think, the importance of resilience in communities and of individuals. And also, I want to touch a bit on the developmental trajectory around children's understanding of race, discrimination, prejudice, and then talk a bit about what we can do as adults, right, to support young people as they're sort of processing some of these different direct experiences they have, as well as they're learning. And just point you to some resources for additional information. So this won't cover everything related to this topic, but I think just to spend a little bit more time about it. So just to remember, what is trauma, right? And what is traumatic stress in particular? It's that biological response to trauma and to reminders of trauma, right? So especially if we've been through lots of traumatic events, then also those reminders trigger some of those same responses. It's also really important to remember that even though many youth are experiencing traumatic events, most of them actually don't ever get treatment. And so while we're not always providing comprehensive mental health services in schools, we are often really the only place that students get much of anything. Other things to remember is that traumatic stress, right? It manifests as those behavioral and emotional symptoms that often, quite frankly, can be misunderstood, right? Could lead to misdiagnosis of like maybe somebody's having attentional and distractibility issues, and maybe it's ADHD, but maybe it's not, right? And also disciplinary action. And so trauma can negatively affect school performance, right? Academic performance, it can affect school culture, as well as our own well-being as educators also, right? That's another place where it can start to impact us. And so right now, in our current times, and not just in our current times, but honestly for decades, right? We've been sort of thinking about and faced with what is racial trauma, and people are talking about this, but people are talking about it far more openly now. And so just some definition of terms, right? So this is similar to post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. It's not necessarily PTSD or anything like that, but there are real reactions, right? And so racial trauma is really unique in that it involves ongoing individual and collective injuries to people due to exposure and re-exposure to stressors that are based on race, right? So some of the reactions can be kind of like those PTSD type reactions, but the circumstances are a bit different, right? Really directly related to race. Historical trauma refers to sort of complex and collective trauma that's experienced over time and across generations by a group of people or groups of people who share an identity, an affiliation, or a circumstance. And so when we think about what this means for kids and for even us as adults, honestly, these connections, right? So we have present day reminders of things that have really been rooted in a lot of past experiences. And so they can be real or perceived, but they don't have to be completely confirmed in order to have an effect on us, right? So just some examples, right? So we can have public reminders. So public reminders are sort of like these ongoing mass traumas, these structural inequalities that we've all been really talking about a lot in the last months. Lack of representation in our media and in our leadership and in our staffing, right? public symbols, right? And so some concrete examples of these are things like the war on drugs, right? Or mass incarceration, not having representation in popular culture, right? Statues, people talk about the statues or the Confederate flag. Also the videos, the exposure to the videos of police shootings and things like that. There's also personal reminders, right? Sort of are the day-to-day kind of things that are very personal, right? So it can be personal connections that we have to historical race or trauma, historical loss or trauma. It can also be very direct experiences of racism, prejudice, discrimination, some of which are very direct and overt, and some of which are not so clear, but yet people are sort of having to think about, like, is that why this happened? And it still has an effect. Microaggressions, right? Those sort of day-to-day comments that maybe seem like they don't mean much, but they collectively really do impact people, as well as sort of personal traumas that might happen. So some examples, some concrete examples are family stories that are passed down, experiences that others have had. Sometimes classroom lessons talk about traumatic events, but are not sort of done as much of a thoughtful way that it can sort of be sort of re-traumatizing for kids, or sort of just like just experienced as sort of negative or traumatic. And hearing or racial slurs, right? Sometimes contact with police and authority, and coded language. These are those really subtle things, right? Like, where are you from? Oh, you're so articulate, you know, suggesting that perhaps, like, why wouldn't you be articulate? And there's many, many more examples of these kinds of things. So in the present day, right, this has current relevance, right? This sort of exposure to racism, systemic discrimination, it has relevance publicly and personally, right? And both communities and individuals, right, have understanding of these events, right, from their family, from society. And so some of this has been going on for a lifetime, right, and following into future generations. And so we are sometimes, right, I think we're hearing a lot, people are reading more, talking more, and learning sort of connections through history of how some of these systems have really still have their present day consequences, right? And particularly this has been coming up as people have been talking about the recent shootings and things like that that have been happening. And this impacts us to this day, right? Health and mental health. So I'm going to share with you some examples from US history. These are by no means meant to be comprehensive, and are not the only communities and individuals that maybe have experienced trauma. And so I'll go through some of them, but if you're sitting as a group and watching this, I would encourage you to pause as we're going and talk about examples that you know of, or that are maybe shared in people's histories, because there's lots of sort of ways that this plays out. So, you know, just a few examples particular to certain groups within the United States. So Native Americans, right? We've sort of got our historical narrative of what's happened, right? Of displacement, of genocide, of intentional sort of efforts for assimilation, to lose culture. They were sort of the boarding schools that happened that were sort of part of that effort, as well as potentially, you know, these harmful government policies and things like that. So if you think about sort of the history, and the history goes pretty deep, right? Learning about that history. And I'm always astounded at how much I've learned, yet how much I don't know, right? And so just being reminded, right? So if you think about what are the trauma reminders that we have, the trauma reminders are, we've been talking a lot about team names and logos, right? And now we have the Washington football team that will be changing its name, and destruction of native land, sort of honoring historical figures, right? We have statues and things to historical figures who've actually participating in displacement or killing of Native Indigenous people in the United States, right? Lack of access. There's a major issue around lack of access to health and mental health resources in Native communities. Less funds spent on that care, right? And all of that, lack of access to equitable educational resources. And so all of those are the current day reminders of things that are related to the history. And then we take that, right, to what are some of the particular health outcomes that have been talked about for Native Americans in our country. And so we have overrepresentation of Native Americans in terms of TB, heart disease, sexually transmitted infections, diabetes. There's been a lot of attention paid to substance abuse, and just overall higher rates of trauma and higher rates and lower life expectancy. So those are some of the things for Native Americans, right? If we sort of trace from the history to the current reminders to some of the ongoing health effects. Another example to share is for Jewish Americans, right? So our historical narrative that we know, right? We had genocide with the Holocaust, mass displacement and moving of peoples, right, to different countries, and immigration, and then very widespread anti-Semitism that has impacted people. And so currently, right, so historically we sort of have this history, we think about especially the history of Europe and in many, many countries, right, sort of the segregation, the sort of differential treatment, and what are the trauma narratives, right? So what are the trauma reminders now, right? Sorry. So that might be the depictions in popular culture using sort of these stereotypes, right, that are sort of shown and even verbalized. We will always continue to have sort of denial of the Holocaust happening, as well as conspiracy theories associated with them that are not really grounded in facts. And also overt hate speech and actions directed towards Jewish people, right? And really recent reminders in the last year, recent events, right? With targeting of temples and synagogues and things like that. And so again, right, we've sort of have ongoing health effects. So one is predisposition to anxiety. It's something that carries through. And then we also have research on children of Holocaust survivors who also have experienced symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's another example of sort of how the historical piece has carried forward into the present day, and to really be cognizant of some of those connections. Another example, and you all, I mean, as we're going through these, I'm sure you can think of many others and sort of other contexts in which this has happened, and maybe even carried through your own families and communities. So for Black Americans, African Americans, we have a major historical narrative around slavery, right, that is part of the founding of our country, and sort of the tying of slavery to our economy, and sort of that the forced part of that. There's so much about that, right, that many of us, I would say, look back and say, we didn't learn about all of it, all the aspects of what slavery meant and what slavery really was like in our country. There's also been sharecropping, segregation, and Jim Crow laws, mass incarceration. People have been talking about sort of the history of the police in the early phases related to mass incarceration, and overt exclusion from resources due to things like the segregation that was happening, not having educational resources. Access to healthcare was very overtly separated and kept, and very clearly different, leaving people out of the economy, right? And so here we have this shared history of which I just, went through very briefly in each of these examples, but then we have our trauma reminders, right? So we have that history, then we have our reminders, and some of our daily reminders now are the videos and images of police violence, the clear videos of differential treatment, the daily microaggressions, right, that I gave an example of before, of more overt discrimination that happens in many urban communities. There's been a lot of gentrification, and sort of what does that bring with it? Confederate symbols, right, and historical figures, and lack of representation in a lot of, not just medical fields. On the slide it says medical fields, but also in lots of other fields, right, when we know that there's research that also shows the positive part of having representation within healthcare, education, and other sectors is really good for kids, right, to have that representation. And so these trauma reminders, right, and this historical setup is really related to current day health effects. So things like chronic stress, hypertension, higher rates being at increased risk for things like post-traumatic stress disorder, diabetes, right, higher risk things like suicidality, and also just kind of the misdiagnosis and things like that. There's been recent research, and actually not so recent research also about sort of like overdiagnosis of psychosis and schizophrenia, so very severe mental illness also. And imagine, understandable, right, low engagement in some health services, right, because of some of the mistrust and fear that is based in history. So just kind of keeping those things in mind. For Asian Americans, we also have a historical narrative that we can trace. One of the big things that we know, right, was Japanese internment in the United States after World War II, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Vietnam War itself brought with it sort of like a differential kind of treatment of folks from Vietnam. There's been displacement and deportation, as well as sort of this acculturation of sort of adopting a certain like sort of predominant culture and leaving behind sort of people's historical culture, right? Some of that has gone on. And then we have a lot of reminders, right? Again, this lack of representation, misrepresentation, and stereotyping in the media, right? We see a lot of that, like what are the stereotypes, and what people talk about is this model minority myth, right? That, which is really about, in a way, pitting sort of the one group, sort of like the Asian Americans who immigrated during a certain time, right, being professional class and being able to immigrate, and so therefore are more model minorities. So sort of how that myth has also played out for people. And so some of the ongoing health effects that have been documented in the research for many Asian American communities has been sort of reluctance to engage in mental health services when they're needed. Again, right, if you don't have representation, right, it's harder to feel comfortable. And underdiagnosis of mental health concerns, which again is sort of like, well, could be related to kind of this model minority idea. So things like that. And then for our Hispanic and Latinx also community, we also have other ones, right? So the historical narrative there has been things like we have strict immigration laws, right? There's been a lot of historically across different Latin American, Central American countries, sort of a loss of land and takeover of land from white colonizers. We have, you know, as a country, interfered a lot in Latin American politics. There's been a history of deportation and family separation, as well as military occupation, right? And we've sort of had these sort of involvement in a lot of this, of stripping resources, not just from the US, but also from other countries as well. And so we've got this historical narrative. And so then we have families and communities from a host of different, and every country, right? If we think about, there's many, many countries we're talking about, and we think about all of that, right? Then we've got sort of our daily trauma reminders, which is things like anti-immigrant rhetoric we see. Recently, we've had these sort of the internment of children and families, the separation of children and families that's been happening, even including reports of deaths of some of these centers. The use of stigmatizing language, some microaggressions, as well as overt racism, just as we were talking about for some other groups, and sort of this kind of otherizing. So we have many, many families who have been here from many different cultural groups who have been in this country and who are US citizens and maybe even for generations. And so they're citizens or longtime residents, yet they're still sort of treated as if they are not, right? And so that's another way that some communities have been, sort of have these reminders. And so again, we have these documented ongoing health effects with higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, again, lower rates of engagement in systems of healthcare and other kinds of systems as well due to fear and concerns. I think we've definitely had times where families have been reluctant to engage in certain things because of fear of real kind of separations and other kinds of actions, right? And then there's high rates of suicidality in the Latinx community, particularly among young women, have been documented. So those are a few reminders and just sort of like examples of things that have happened. If we're trying to just take some examples to trace sort of our historical lens to our current sort of trauma reminders to kind of the health and mental health effects that we see. And like I said, it's not meant to be comprehensive, but I think it's just meant to be kind of an introduction, and any one of these topics, right, we could really deep dive on and learn a lot more about. And so that's what those are for. And then the way we want to sort of think about this, right, is what is our resilience, right? And so to remember that individuals and communities are resilient and that we actually have a lot of strength from different communities that we've gained based on some of this. And I think that we want to honor that. And so with those stories of trauma and struggle are also stories of resilience, right? And so we're talking not just about we're surviving, but transcending and thriving. And so all of us in schools, when we think about sort of the hope and the support, and so many people have been talking about in the wake of the pandemic, just how important schools are. And even if we're not always in physical school, that school connectedness is an important protective factor. And so we have that opportunity to provide that kind of connection for kids to each other and to staff and things like that. So that's just a bit on kind of the background. And I want to close our last little section here with talking a bit more about so then when we're working with our students, right? And they're bringing up questions about discrimination and race, and we want to talk about this because it's important, it's relevant, it's part of our current events, right? How do we do that? And so we just need to recognize, right, young people need some help navigating navigating the world, right? And so we can really increase resilience by engaging with them around some of these discussions. So just developmentally, I want to cover just how children do see race. And so, when they're really little, when they're in the preschool to kindergarten age, right, we start to notice differences with other people. And it's really based in curiosity, a lot of it, right? And so we have a lot of potential here to kind of have an important and productive influence on kids, that it's okay to be maybe it's okay to be curious. And sometimes they ask us questions that we feel uncomfortable about, but for them are very just based in curiosity, right? And so they may even be observing and noting our biases and our judgments, right? They're starting to notice some of that stuff, right? They're watching that. And then as they get older into sort of elementary school age, this is a big time, of course, of craving belonging. Their social lives get much richer, and they're starting to test some boundaries, right? Practice their values. And parents are now not the only influence, right? There's also other people influencing. And they may actually start to be on the receiving end of exclusion based on physical appearance. So that might start happening, or they're talking about it. And then in adolescence, we're really talking about kids kind of really trying to seek their identity. They have a self-image they're navigating, right, in the wake of whatever else is happening outside them. And that their values and their mistakes start to have some real world consequences, right? And they're really trying to grapple with social status and all of those things. So just kind of trying to keep that in mind. But they love to talk. They respond well to questions and inquiry, and what they see from adults, right? How they see adults treating others. They're really paying attention to that. So that's important for us to kind of keep aware of. So here are just some strategies, right? What can you do, right? So you're thinking about working with kids at different ages. For the little ones, right, we want to embrace their curiosity. We want to be open and honest. We want to foster pride, lead by example, right, which is going to come through across all the ages, right? For the school age kids, the elementary age kids, again, we want to model. We want to start to challenge intolerance when we see it, right? Seize teachable moments, emphasize positive connectedness, and the same thing with our adolescents, right? Practicing what we preach is big, right? Talking, they really like to talk, and I think it's a nice age to help them move a little bit out of their own comfort zone and encourage their own activism around these issues if they're really engaged in talking about it. So there have been, I know some schools have started kind of more student involvement in discussions around equity and things like that. And so those are great places, I think, especially for our adolescents to really engage around this and have opportunity to be active. So those are some examples just from the developmental lens. In the classroom, right, one of the things that we can think about is, what is the content of what we're talking about? And while we can't control everything and make everything perfect, we can potentially anticipate some trauma reminders, and so I know that I've had teachers for my own kids say, this is what we're covering. We're planning to show this video. This is how we're going to talk about it. Just in case your kids have questions, they might come to you, things like that. So sometimes a little communication from teachers to caregivers can be nice. Ensuring representation within lessons, materials, being mindful of our language. And I think just also, we're not going to be perfect. We're certainly not going to be perfect. And I think this is a place where we're all kind of learners. And so allowing space for dialogue, leading with empathy, modeling good communication, right? Helping them, and also using processes. So there's been a lot of attention paid to doing things like restorative circles, different kinds of art and music activities that can kind of create different kind of ways to communicate, and just respecting differences in opinion, allowing those to be there, differences in culture, right? Talking with our own colleagues about, like, what have you tried? How did that go? What can I try? And that kind of thing. And just respect and honor that some of our students really are impacted directly. Some of them are less impacted directly, but just to be aware of that. So just thinking about that as well. So those are some things you can do in the classroom. And so here are just some other some resources. These are particularly helpful for parents and caregivers. So if you want to pass on any resources to parents and caregivers, here are some good ones. And just also, just like for as you're advising the parents, I think it's really the same thing that I was saying for the teachers, right? Just don't pretend differences don't exist, but just sort of respond to the curiosity, use those teachable moments, talk to them as they grow, let them have new experiences, right? And I think, again, like, we are role models in this, right? And helping them when they have to be proud of their own heritage and all of that in their family. That's right. All of that is tied. Identity, self-esteem, all of those things are really tied together in child development at this stage. So just helping them with some of those. And encourage them, right? I think one of the things that's great is that they do speak out about things, and it's great to encourage their learning and their talking about the issues. For ourselves, you know, I think we're sort of in a unique moment of a million different things being out there, of things that we can do for adults to learn. And I think the big thing is just to start to expand our knowledge, right? There are different tools out there to build awareness of ourselves. So Harvard has this implicit bias project as just one example, but there's lots of others. I know some organizations have brought in teams to kind of help support learning and around some of these issues. And just understand, you know, like, we all have diverse experience and emotional responses, even within the same group. People react to the same material in different ways. And I think just being able to listen and sort of say, okay, yeah, I get that, I see that, you know, and here's my experience or my thought, and practice self-care. I think more in the current times, not just because of the pandemic, but because of also some of the issues that have been happening, these sort of conversations we're having about racism. I think there's a lot that we need to also do to practice our own self-care in these moments as well. Here are some more resources. Some of them I already shared, but these are some great places that people have more around racism and historic trauma, as well as teaching others. So just so you know, these are out there in case you're interested in a deeper dive. Some really nice resources are there. If I was with you again, we'd have a nice time to discuss and talk. I'm not with you in person, but if I was, we would do that. And I thank you. I thank you again for your time. And that's it.